From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Sentencing in Donald Trump's hush money trial in New York is delayed until September, following the conventions and a second scheduled presidential debate.
This as President Biden pulls in $127 million in the month of June, $38 million of that since his debate performance last week, despite calls for him to drop out of the race.
We'll bring you new polling in the race from Cliff Young at Ipsos, and we'll talk with Angela Stent of the Brookings Institution ahead of another important test for President Biden, next week's NATO Summit here in Washington. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday. Live from Washington, we begin with the fallout from yesterday's Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. Donald Trump's sentencing in his New York hush money case delayed from next week now to September 18th after he requested to have his conviction in that case overturned. Let's go now to Bloomberg's Sara Fordan for the latest on this. Sara, welcome to the table. It's great to have you. How could this move so quickly? The ruling at 10 o'clock yesterday morning and now this.
Yeah, Trump's lawyers wasted no time in making their filing to have this case, thrown out. Basically, they had to ask the judge for permission to file a motion to have the verdict thrown out. And now the judge has accepted that and will set a hearing in order to parse the questions that have been raised in this case by the Supreme Court's immunity ruling.
Well, of course, the questions that have been raised not only pertain to what is an official act versus an unofficial private act, but also the way in which official acts can be used as evidence or anything done in a presidential capacity. Could that be potentially what trips up this already decided case where a verdict has already come down, but potentially some of that evidence may be in question? So
that is exactly the point. So the judge is going to have to review if there was evidence introduced before the jury that were part of his acts as president. So some of the issues they'll be looking at are tweets and social media posts that he made as president, testimony from White House staffers, and some of his financial filings. But in fact, the bulk of this case, as we know, involved actions that happened well before the election because it was about his effort to tamp down the story, so it wouldn't compromise his election. So, but all of this now has to be parsed. The judge is taking it very seriously. We're going to have filings from Trump's team next week on July 10th, where they will lay out, their issues. And then the prosecutor, Bragg, will then respond to those at a later date. So it's now a whole new dimension of this case that is unfolding before our eyes.
We heard from the president on this Supreme Court ruling, Joe Biden addressing what we heard from the Supreme Court in a late speech from the White House. He spoke just before 8 p.m. Here's what he said.
I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers I have for 3.5 years. But any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. I concur with Justice Sotomayor's dissent today. Here's what she said. She said, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. With fear for our democracy, I dissent. End of quote. So should the American people dissent. I dissent.
It's interesting in this case, Joe Biden, of course, may not be president come November. If Donald Trump is sentenced in September, and let's say that includes an ankle bracelet or some level of probation, would he then carry that with him into the White House? Would he be meeting with a probation officer, or would that stop at the White House gates?
Well, now with this new wrinkle of the immunity question, it's also possible that if Judge Merchan decides to go ahead with the sentencing, he would then it could be adjudicated on appeal and addressed on appeal. So it's very unlikely that a sentence will actually go into effect in the near term, and if Trump is elected before he gets into the White House. So obviously we still have to see how this case evolves, and there are a lot of surprises along the way. But most experts who are watching this aren't thinking that there's actually going to be a sentence in effect if he gets into the White House. It could be suspended. It will be addressed on appeal. So,
and of course, all of that is just this New York case. Right. The Supreme Court the heart of it was about the case against him here in Washington. We'll have to see how Judge Tanya Chutkan handles that going forward now that it's been remanded down to her. Bloomberg's Sara Fordan, thank you so much for joining us. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reporting that President Biden will convene a Zoom meeting tomorrow with Democratic governors, including several rumored as potential replacements for the nomination, like California's Gavin Newsom and Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer, as he tries to close ranks after his poor debate performance last week. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre briefed the media for the first time since then this afternoon.
We understand. We're not taking away from what you all saw or what the American people saw. We understand. It was a bad night. It is not uncommon for incumbents to have a bad night on their first debate.
She also said President Biden will speak with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries this week after one Democratic lawmaker broke ranks. Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas today making news, calling on Joe Biden to step aside in this race, writing in a statement, quote, "I represent the heart of a congressional district once represented by Lyndon Johnson. Under very different circumstances, he made the painful decision to withdraw. President Biden should do the same. While much of his work has been transformational, he pledged to be transitional," unquote.
Of course, while President Biden fields questions about his fitness for office, he is still carrying out his presidential duties, and he's set to hold a press conference next week as Washington hosts the NATO Summit. Russia's war in Ukraine and U.S. support for Ukraine will be chief among the topics discussed as world leaders gather. Here's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin after meeting with Ukraine's defense minister earlier today.
Now, as we look ahead to the NATO summit next week, Rustem, we'll take steps to build a bridge to NATO membership for Ukraine. Just weeks ago, President Zelensky and President Biden signed a crucial 10-year bilateral security agreement. And that reflects our strong and enduring support for Ukraine.
Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams is joining us now for more. He leads our national security coverage from here in Washington. So, Nick, we heard the defense secretary there talking about a bridge to NATO membership for Ukraine. Are we likely to see tangible steps in that direction take place at this meeting next week?
No. So what's happening here is if you listen to that language, a bridge to membership, that in itself is a significant walk back from what the U.S. and allies had said before, and also what Ukraine wants. Ukraine wants a very specific plan, essentially a roadmap to membership. There has been a lot of debate and a lot of conversation behind the scenes among allies, NATO countries, about what they can tell Ukraine. And right now the answer is essentially they can't really say very much. So when you hear this language, a bridge to membership, I mean, that can mean almost anything you want. What they're essentially saying is, yes, we still think Ukraine should be a member of NATO at some point, but right now we're not going to give you a time frame, we're not going to give you a roadmap, we're not going to give you a way forward to how this goes. We're just telling you we want to do it, but we're not giving you any guarantees.
This summit comes at a peculiar time here for politics in the United States, never mind, say, France. Yeah. How do our allies in Europe have long-term conversations with Joe Biden, considering the one that's being had here at home?
Well, the answer to that is, again, they don't. I mean, there is the huge cloud looming over this summit, which is the possibility of a Donald Trump election. What we're hearing from the Trump campaign and people adjacent to him, Republicans who are pushing a sort of more conservative approach to NATO, would be, okay, we are not going to back out of NATO if Donald Trump wins, but we're not going to offer those security guarantees to countries unless they pay up, unless they meet that 2% of GDP target for defense spending. Of course, that's a kind of conversation that would completely roil the dialogue and the conversation we're going to see next week. So, I mean, the most interesting thing to me about this summit is this was a summit that was really meant to demonstrate will, demonstrate support for Ukraine, demonstrate resolve in the face of the Russian invasion. What you're essentially seeing is exactly the opposite. These leaders are not really going to be able to agree on a path forward for Ukraine. Joe Biden is hobbled by the debate performance. Emmanuel Macron hobbled by election results in France. So it's going to be a very shaky meeting.
And you're potentially going to have turnover, switch in power in the UK government after their election that comes up on Thursday. So it's a lot of world powers having power shifts within them all at once, perhaps. To what extent, as well, is this NATO summit about Russia as much as it is about those that are helping Russia, say China or others in this so-called axis of evil, as some have described it? To what extent do those feature into the NATO meeting?
Well, I think what you're going to see is obviously a message toward Russia saying, look, we want to project this aura of resolve, that Russia should not continue with the invasion, though it shows no sign of being deterred, but also a message to other countries, specifically China and Iran. Listen, do not continue to aid Russia in its invasion. The problem there is that we just see no sign that either China or Iran is interested in listening to that message. In fact, everything we're seeing is that China's cooperation with Russia, for example, is only deepening. So, again, a huge challenge for these leaders. In some ways, the summit comes at just the wrong time for them. So we'll have to see how it goes.
Sure sounds like it. You've got an interesting week coming up. Stay in touch with us. Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams at the table here on Balance of Power. Coming up, we turn back to the future of the Democratic Party and the reaction to President Biden's candidacy. Following last week's debate, we have new polling. Cliff Young, Ipsos Polling President, will share with us next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
I was giving him about a 1 in 3 chance before the debate. And now, it's certainly longer odds than that. Democrats, it's a soul-searching time. They don't want to hurt him. They like him. But at the same time, boy, they don't want to go down. They shouldn't want to go down with the ship.
It's Charlie Cook, of course, the man behind the Cook Political Report, talking with us at this time yesterday on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, as Americans size up the impact or try to of last week's presidential debate. It's been an ongoing conversation on this program, so far largely anecdotal, and we put numbers on it now with Cliff Young, the president of Ipsos Polling. Cliff, it's great to see you. Welcome back to the table. As I mentioned, been a lot of talk about this, not so much research, with the exception of a couple of snap polls. What are you learning about people's ideas, knowing that this age issue was already alive and well before the debate?
Now, we have now 3 polls, one pre-debate, right before the debate, one right after the debate, and one today. A general poll of the national population. Mm-hmm. And we found several things. First, everyone agrees that he did not do well. That is, Biden did not do well in the debate. It doesn't matter what poll it was, what measure it was across the board. It was really a poor performance. Indeed, our wording was terrible. 73% of those that watched it said it was a terrible performance. Wow. And so there's no sort of disagreement there. That said, we are not finding an impact on the primary political outcomes that matter. Voting intention, favorability scores, approval ratings. So thus far, everything's changed, but nothing's changed.
How about that?
Okay, so maybe you're not seeing any real change in polling, but certainly you're still seeing plenty of fretting on the part of those in the Democratic Party. You have also found in this 1 in 3 Democrats think Biden should quit the race. That's not an insignificant number, 33%.
Yeah, that's a chunky number. Now overall, 56% of Americans think he should step down. Mm-hmm. A chunk of that obviously being driven by Republicans. 1/3 is a lot, but he still controls the base. Right now, things can change over the next few weeks, and we will have to see. But today, he still garners a majority support among Democrats.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to ask you about some of the names that we're hearing about here. But the reaction to this debate, to your point, is one that is not up for debate. We even heard from the White House today about how difficult this was. Congressman Quigley was, for instance, speaking about this earlier. I think this was on MSNBC. Do we have that? It was on CNN. Thanks. This is the congressman, a Democrat from Illinois. Let's listen.
We have to be honest with ourselves that it wasn't just a horrible night. But I won't go beyond that out of my respect and understanding President Joe Biden, the very proud person who has served us extraordinarily well for 50 years. But it's his decision. I just want him to appreciate at this time just how much it impacts not just his race, but all the other races coming in November.
Well, for whatever that's worth, it's another voice. We heard from Congressman Seth Moulton on earlier today, talked about the active conversation that's being had. And we have now a Democratic congressman from Texas calling for Joe Biden to drop out of the race. So the question then becomes, well, who else? And I don't keep hearing the name Kamala Harris in that conversation. How about you?
We actually tested her in our poll.
Sure did.
And she actually does pretty well. And I think, reflecting on it a bit, to what extent, we don't know, obviously, but to what extent might there be a rally around the banner effect? In other words, independent of the name, could basically the base step up and support whomever is there if he were to step down? We don't know that. That's something that's unknown at this point, but it's something interesting to reflect on.
Yeah, this kind of question is, does it matter who the other option is if it is another option, which so many have signaled in polling and otherwise they're begging for, that they don't want the choice between Biden and Trump. They want a different choice. So could that be one that they select as another Democratic nominee? But there are also technically different choices out there. Cliff RFK Jr., for example, Cornel West, Jill Stein. Have we seen any transmission from the debate performance into the polling, the way that these third parties are polling, or are Americans not really seeing them as viable alternatives?
Now, we would expect a weakening on the edges, Biden losing a few percentage points here or there. They could migrate to one of these third-party candidates. We would expect that. I wouldn't expect it to be permanent. It would be a temporary fix, let's say, until those voters find someone they prefer or step out completely and they ultimately decide not to vote. But yes, they're still in the mix. We still don't understand how that will all behave, and we have to wait and see.
We keep hearing names like Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom. Those names were being spoken out loud the night of the debate while we were still in our post-debate coverage here. But they don't come close to the president or the vice president, based on what you
Yeah, they're depending on how you ask the question, they're 3, 4, 5, 6 points out from Trump. But a lot of that is name recognition. We have to understand that Donald Trump today has 99% name recognition. Most of these other candidates, these Democratic candidates, are in the ballpark of 50 or 60. Perhaps that's something that could be resolved or zeroed out during the campaign, but they do have a name recognition disadvantage at this point.
Although if you're, say, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, you have probably very high name recognition in a crucial swing state, which potentially is something to consider. And I wonder, to the extent that we've looked now at your new national polling and you've seen some other national polls where there isn't a lot of movement, do you expect what ultimately will matter most, especially within the Biden campaign, with the president himself making a decision as to whether this should continue forward, is more of a deterioration in those swing state polls, even if you're not seeing nationally that much of a difference?
Yeah, national poll is good in a quick turnaround to see what's going on. It's a thermometer, directionally speaking. But really, the swing states will matter. And so we're going to have to wait a bit the next couple of weeks. Ipsos has a swing state poll next week, and we will see. But those would be the critical sort of inputs that I believe would be used to make any sort of decision.
Do you think it's possible that we could be adding to the list of swing states as a result of this debate performance, say the ones Donald Trump has been talking about, like Virginia and Minnesota, which you've suggested is winnable for him?
I think that's possible, but that's really if the dam breaks. Whether it's, is Biden sort of status quo? He didn't gain any ground, but he's not going to lose any ground. Or does he lose ground? We're not quite sure about those two scenarios. If other states are opening up, that means he's losing ground. And he's especially losing ground with those key constituencies that he needs to bring into the fold: Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, younger Americans, and less affluent ones. All I call inflation orphans.
All right. Well, the demographics are certainly important here. Thank you so much to Cliff Young of Ipsos, out with new polling today. We appreciate you sharing it with us. Now, coming up, President Biden today briefed on Hurricane Beryl. This is the White House unveils new policies to address extreme weather. We'll have more on those plans next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. A history-making storm is leaving a path of destruction through the Caribbean. President Biden says what's being called Hurricane Beryl is shedding light on the connection between extreme weather events and the impacts of climate change. Bloomberg's Kendall is at the White House this evening with more. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kaylee, this is the first time ever a Category 5 hurricane has formed over the Atlantic. For context, storms of this size don't typically form until the end of August or early September. But we do know that President Biden was briefed on Hurricane Beryl earlier today, and he used the moment to connect extreme weather with his climate change policies.
Extreme weather events drive home a point that I've been saying for so long. Ignoring climate change is deadly and dangerous and irresponsible. These climate-fueled extreme weather events don't just affect people's lives, they also cost money, they hurt the economy, and they have a significant negative psychological effect on people.
You heard the president mention the monetary cost there. Hurricane Beryl is heading towards Jamaica right now. Early estimates are putting potential damages there at $1 billion. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA as you might know it, has found an increase in the intensity of hurricanes like this one linked to warmer waters in the Atlantic. Experts say it's a stark warning ahead of what's predicted to be an active hurricane season. NOAA right now forecasts 8 to 13 hurricanes between now and November when the hurricane season ends. That's considered to be above normal. Now, while the storm is expected to miss the U.S., President Biden says that they are watching this situation and monitoring it closely, and also went on to tout the ways his administration is working to protect Americans right now from extreme weather. That includes one new proposed rule today that, if implemented, would protect an estimated 36 million American workers from injury when it comes to excessive heat on the job. Joe and Kaylee, if implemented, this rule would become the first federal safety statute of its kind.
Brings us to the climate policy, Tyler, in this White House. What's the president saying today about his plans to mitigate climate change, knowing the Supreme Court just essentially overturned the Chevron doctrine this week?
Right, exactly. As you've been covering, climate has become an integral part of President Biden's re-election today. He pointed out how FEMA has worked to secure an additional $1 billion in grants when it comes to helping local communities reeling from natural disasters, and also is talking a lot about these resiliency policies. Those have to do with more things on the local level, such as renewing building codes to make sure that they're up to speed when it comes to erosion and other potential climate impacts. Now, for his part, former President Trump, during the debate last week, hit President Biden on his climate policies. He called it the Green New Scam, and also said that he would work to dismantle some of the regulations that this White House has put into place.
There you have it. Today at the White House, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall from the North Lawn. We thank you for the update, Tyler. Coming up, we'll look ahead to next week's NATO Summit, something the White House is preparing for as well as we speak, and how the alliance will focus on the war in Ukraine. Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, joins us next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Alongside some 50 allies and partners, we'll continue to provide the critical capabilities that Ukraine needs to push back Russian aggression today and to deter Russian aggression tomorrow. And I am proud that the United States will soon announce more than $2.3 billion in new security assistance for Ukraine.
That was U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin earlier today at a meeting with Ukraine's Minister of Defense, announcing additional aid coming soon for Ukraine. It comes a week ahead of the NATO summit here in Washington, where the country's ongoing war with Russia is expected to dominate the conversation. Joining us now for a preview is Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Angela, welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Always great to have you. And what an interesting moment to have you as we look ahead to a NATO summit happening next week. It's against a backdrop of questions around the U.S. president's acuity and fitness for office, whether or not he is even going to continue running for a second term. A French president that has been weakened by far-right party victories in Parliament. A UK election that has to happen before these leaders gather. How difficult does this make the moment for the alliance as they try to project unity, and yet so many individually are facing turmoil?
So there's a lot of domestic political turbulence in the United States, in Europe. But the aim of this summit really is to get the 32 members of NATO and 4 Asian allies, and then Ukraine and other partners to come and pledge their support for Ukraine against this ongoing war with Russia, which the Russians have really been stepping up recently. There may be a different UK leader at the NATO summit. We don't know that. That's what happened to Winston Churchill after, at the end of World War II. He was defeated, and his successor, a Labour Prime Minister, had to come to the final meeting in Potsdam anyway. And of course, we don't know with the French elections, if the far right wins a majority in the French legislature, then French policies towards Ukraine may change. Of course, if Donald Trump wins in the United States in November, then American policy toward Ukraine and Russia will change. But still, I think the allies are determined to put on a show of unity with support for Ukraine and really highlighting the dangers to the European continent that this war presents.
With those potential changes in mind, Angela, it's interesting to see Volodymyr Zelensky appearing alongside Viktor Orban today. Obviously a disruptor in the EU's mission here, and not always a friend of President Zelensky, considering his close relationship, Orban's, with Vladimir Putin. I don't know what you think of Zelensky's choice to meet with him, but Orban was there to press Ukraine to consider a ceasefire proposal. I wonder what our NATO allies think of that.
So, Hungary has just taken over the presidency of the European Council. So for the next 6 months, Prime Minister Orban will have quite a lot to say about the agenda for what's going to happen between the European Union and Ukraine. Ukraine has just started accession talks with the European Union. It would very much like these to progress. So even though this is Orban's first visit to Ukraine since the outbreak of the war in 2022, I think practically every other European leader has been to Ukraine. I think it makes sense from Zelensky's point of view to try and have a dialogue with Orban and make sure that Ukraine-EU relations progress over the next 6 months. Now, we know that Prime Minister Orban said that there should be a ceasefire. We know that President Zelensky pushed back against that, but he's trying to smooth the way, I would say, for the next 6 months.
Well, as you, Angela, talk about this idea of Ukraine joining the European Union, there also is the question of Ukraine joining NATO itself. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, today described the idea that they should have a bridge to membership. What exactly does that mean? Is there any real prospect of Ukraine joining this alliance in the near to medium term?
Well, I don't think anybody's quite sure what the bridge means. I mean, there's now going to be a new office in Wiesbaden in Germany where there'll be more military support for Ukraine. NATO is sending a civilian representative to Ukraine. I think that's going to be announced next week, who will be advising the Ukrainian government on the kind of reforms they need to undertake to join NATO. But the Biden administration and other allies, including Germany, have said there's no question of Ukraine joining NATO as long as there's a war going on, because that could then get involved NATO members, particularly the United States, could then get involved in a direct conflict with Russia. So even though the Ukrainians would very much have liked to have had a roadmap presented next week of how to take the steps to join NATO, and some of the Central and East European countries in NATO would have favored that too. I think we may hear more about the bridge, but I think no one believes that Ukraine can join NATO as long as this conflict goes on, and it could go on for a long time. And of course, the same is true with the European Union for different reasons. It can take a long time to join the European Union and fill all the conditions that they ask for.
So I guess what I'm hearing from you then, Angela, is this NATO summit is going to be one big photo opportunity.
Well, I mean, it'll be a photo opportunity, but there'll certainly be substance to it. And there will be pledges made, and there'll be discussions about how to constrain what Russia is doing. But the aim is to show that this is the 75th anniversary of the founding of NATO, the most successful alliance really in history, and to show unity with the 2 new members, Finland and Sweden, attending after Putin, had said that he, years ago, that he didn't want NATO to enlarge. So it's a little bit more. I mean, it's more than a photo opportunity, but we'll have to see what substance comes out of it.
Well, Angela, earlier today, Bloomberg caught up with Julianne Smith, the U.S. ambassador to NATO, who spoke about the war in Ukraine and specifically about China's involvement. This is what she told us.
China takes every effort, every chance it can get to argue that somehow it's a neutral player in this war in Ukraine. But in reality, the PRC is providing a long list of dual-use components, things like machine tools and microelectronics that are enabling Russia to pursue this war of aggression in Ukraine.
So to the point you were making, Angela, about NATO wanting to act to restrain Russia, can Russia really be restrained without restraining China by extension?
Well, it's an excellent question. Secretary Blinken yesterday gave a speech at Brookings where he talked about this again, that China really has to rethink and stop these sales of goods to Russia that enable it to continue the fight, that strengthen its defense industrial base. I think China understands that there could be a prospect of more sanctions on China now for what it's doing. China, as Ambassador Smith said, is certainly not a neutral party in this conflict. And if it continues to supply Russia, plus, of course, North Korea, which Putin just visited last week and signed a military alliance agreement with, if these countries don't stop providing weapons, artillery, etc., to Russia, then it will be very difficult to see this war wind down.
Angela, a group of House Democrats is urging the Pentagon to begin training more Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets. We're looking ahead in this case many months that it would take, of course, for them to be ready. Will it make a difference?
So the first F-16s are supposed to arrive in Ukraine maybe next week, the week after. The Russians bombed an airfield in Ukraine today where they think the F-16s will arrive. I think it will make a difference. Unfortunately, it takes a long time to train the pilots. They have to have the English language skills for that. Some of them are trained in the United States, somewhere elsewhere. But it will help the Ukrainians need to combat Russian air power in a way that they really haven't been able to do because they're so vulnerable to it. So hopefully it will make some difference. But I think it's still the Ukrainians in a very difficult military position at the moment. And the most they can do, I think, for the rest of the year is to defend their territory from Russia taking any more of it.
Angela, thanks so much, as always, for being with us. Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, the Biden campaign announcing June fundraising and a big haul, $127 million, with tens of millions of that raised since last week's debate, said to be a disaster. We'll play it to the political panel next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
I've had a lot of conversations about this, candidly, and there's certainly a view that the chaos that would follow would be worse than just having a nominee that we know and that can trust. And then, of course, there's the other view that the debate was a disaster, and we just need to move on. I'm not sure exactly what the right answer is yet here, but I can tell you, we are having those serious conversations, as any serious party should.
Part of our serious conversation with Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton earlier today here on Bloomberg TV and radio, talking about the future of President Biden's candidacy. This as the Biden and Trump campaigns release their fundraising numbers from June. This is important considering we had the debate at the end of the month. President Biden announcing a $127 million haul, outscoring the $112 million figure from former President Trump. Important. $38 million of Joe Biden's take came from Thursday on, the night of this so-called disastrous debate. So what's going on here? Our political panel is with us to talk it out. Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC Communications Director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast, alongside Matt Bennett, co-founder of Third Way. Matt, I know you've been part of this conversation as well, so I'd like to get into this with you. Some of this is being had publicly now. We have a member of Congress, a representative, Democrat from Texas, calling for Joe Biden to drop out of the race. But it strikes me that more members of the party sound like Seth Moulton, where we have a serious conversation. We have a couple of options here, but we're really not sure which way to go. Do you choose the chaos of a contested convention and throw out the legacy of this president based on one night of debate, or acknowledge that someone else might have a better chance beating Donald Trump? Where are you on this?
Yeah, I'm with Moulton. I mean, there isn't any good option available to us. And if there was, everybody would be gravitating toward it. But there just isn't. And I think a lot of the commentary has been very pat in that regard. Oh, it's going to be great. You know, it's going to show so much dynamism in the party to have the president step aside, which is a monumental thing that we haven't seen in, 5 decades. And then to have an open convention or a coronation of the vice president. Both things are unprecedented in modern times. So it is not at all clear to me which is the better course. I do know that if the president's going to stay in the race, he needs to get out there aggressively, publicly, and much more than we have seen in the last 4 days. I mean, he has done 2 televised teleprompter speeches, one from the White House last night, one in North Carolina. That's basically it. He needs to do a lot more to allay these concerns.
Well, we do know he'll be sitting down for an interview with ABC on Friday. But, Matt, you just mentioned there the idea that you could potentially see a coronation of Vice President Kamala Harris if Biden does indeed step back. This is something Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina spoke about earlier today on MSNBC.
I will support her if he were to step aside. But I want to support her going forward at some time in the future. I want this ticket to continue to be Biden-Harris.
And interestingly, we did see a poll out from CNN today, which finds that if it's Trump-Biden, Trump leads by 6 points, 49 to 43%. Lisa, for a Trump-Kamala Harris hypothetical matchup, she's only 2 points behind him. For all of the talk about the weakness of her potentially as a vice president, could she actually beat Donald Trump, or is being attached to this administration just too problematic?
I'm not sure that it's being attached to this administration that causes the problem. This is an entirely uncharted territory for all voters, right? They're looking at 2 candidates that they largely do not like. Thursday night, I said to Joe, not long after I watched the debate, that I think Joe Biden lost the election last Thursday night. I think it's over for him. And so everybody is looking for an option. Voters are taking a third look at RFK Jr. for the first time ever. And so if the fact that the vice president is polling that high tells me that that's because voters are looking for just about any other option than the 2 that they have.
It's really something. I've quoted you a few times on that. Rick Davis said the same thing. Joe Biden lost the election Thursday night. This conversation is over. Either pick someone else or deal with the facts. Matt, what makes you think that's not the case? Charlie Cook was with us last night. He said he had a 1 in 3 chance before the debate. Now it's lower than that. Do you believe Joe Biden could beat Donald Trump right now, despite the polls telling us otherwise?
Look, I think we have to be very skeptical of people like me and Lisa and Rick and all of us, because we were super wrong in 2016, where we thought that Hillary was going to win at like 7 o'clock on election night. So we don't know. What I do know is that if the president wants to compete for this, he can't do it the way he's been doing it the last 4 days. If that continues, he will lose for sure. If he has the mental and physical wherewithal to get out there and really fight for this thing, then he can win. He's got 4 months to turn it around. That's enough time, but he's got to show us that he has that.
Okay, so as we all here play the guessing game, waiting to see if polls tell us more about how the debate may have shifted things, or whether polls could turn out to be entirely wrong, as we have seen in cycles past, as Matt is alluding to, I wonder to what extent the money does some talking, Lisa. To Joe's point, Joe Biden raised $38 million since that debate performance on Thursday. How telling is that?
Well, I think it's telling that regardless of how he performed, people are still in favor of anyone other than Donald Trump. And that's really what I think. I think that while I don't think, to Matt's point about the president getting out there more. I think that is the bigger risk. To get him out there more demonstrates that he has declined over the course of the last 4 months and will continue to decline over the course of the next 4 years. And so that's a real challenge. So is fundraising an indication that people are in favor of anyone other than Donald Trump? Yes, I think so. But I don't necessarily know if that's a vote of confidence for Joe Biden as opposed to a vote of confidence for anybody other than the other
Is this
candidate. Friday
interview with George Stephanopoulos a smart move?
I'm sure that they're going to coach him up. I'm sure it's going to go very well for him. I also don't think it's going to change anybody's mind, because I think that people made up their mind 10 minutes into the debate last Thursday that Joe Biden is past his prime and ready to step aside.
All right, Lisa and Matt are sticking with us, because coming up, what about those third-party candidates? Lisa mentioned one, RFK Jr. We'll talk a little bit more about whether someone like him could start to gain traction in the aftermath of the debate last week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
70% of the American public say they don't want this contest. The only argument they have is be scared of that other guy. He's a felon. He's a bad guy. He's going to destroy the republic. They're running on fear. If Americans want to vote out of fear, they're going to vote for these guys. If they want to vote out of hope, they're going to vote out of me.
That was independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. responding to questions on debate night last week, even though he did not qualify to actually make it on the stage with President Biden and Donald Trump. Back with us now, our political panel, Lisa Camooso Miller and Matt Bennett. Of course, RFK Jr. is the subject of a much talked about Vanity Fair piece today in which they did a deep dive into his history. It reads in part, Kennedy's personal history is not dissimilar to Trump's. A bottomless well of scandal that over time has immunized people against its real-world consequences. The Kennedy name, the fantasy and celebrity of it, is its own shield, blinding people to the fine details of Kennedy's actual beliefs. Now, this is a tame part of the piece, Matt. It also described allegations of sexual assault, of him posing next to a barbecued dog in Korea. To what extent is RFK Jr. potentially going to be seen as a more serious contender in this race in the aftermath of the debate, even given revelations like that?
Well, unfortunately, I think that is going to be the case for some voters. They're going to be looking for another option, and they're going to look at him because his name is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And there's a lot of Kennedys out there, and most of them are fairly similar politically and, kind of personally. But he is a gigantic outlier. As you noted, the Vanity Fair piece is chock full of horrifying things about him, but there's a lot more. Mostly, he is a conspiracy monger who has been directly responsible for many, many people being injured or dying as a result of his craziness about vaccines and other things. So people need to take a hard look at RFK before they go to him. And one other point on him. Unlike all of the other Kennedys, almost all of whom have endorsed the president and are Democrats, RFK's rhetoric is a whole lot closer to Trump's than it is to Biden's. He has kind of descended into this chaotic conspiracy world that has moved him closer to MAGA than it is to the Democratic Party.
Can we get back to the dog for a moment? Vanity Fair, with this image of him with a barbecued dog carcass. 13 pair of ribs, including the floating rib. We know this is a canine. Call coming from Kristi Noem. That's a disqualifier, right?
I was going to say the same thing. If shooting your dog or barbecuing a dog is a disqualifier, then yes, this absolutely should be one of those.
Yeah.
If you'll remember, Mitt Romney also got in trouble for putting the dog on the top of the station wagon during a family
trip. Seems quaint
trip.
at this point.
That
dog lived.
Yeah, that. The Vanity Fair piece is damning beyond. I mean, there is just chock full is the best way that Matt put it. It is full of all of the disqualifiers. First and foremost, his entire family is against him running. And that's enough of a reason for us to take a second look. But I think Matt's point is good, too. So many of the theories that he espouses and talks about are so close to the things that you hear from the MAGA crowd that anybody who's looking for an option other than Donald Trump should not be taking that option to an RFK Jr.
Wow.
And yet, do you think they will? with the Kennedy name, that to the point that Matt was making, he does have a certain degree of name recognition. Does it matter what his policies are if he's not Trump or Biden?
I'm not sure it matters so much, especially to those who are paying closer attention to his campaign, like the younger voters, for instance. They're not ordinarily very easy to rely on. But I think this time around, with TikTok and other options, we're going to be seeing him as an option for them.
And a lot of political upside for Commander as well this evening. Matt Bennett, Lisa Camooso Miller, we thank you very much, with apologies to the presidential dog. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. I don't know if you'll find that RFK story on the terminal and online.
And, of course, Balance of Power is going to be taking a break for the 4th of July holiday. So enjoy, everyone. We'll see you back here on Monday on Bloomberg TV and radio.